My name is Bruce Ankowiak. I'm the chair of the criminology department here at St. Vincent College. On behalf of Archabbot Douglas, our president, Brother Norman, our McKenna School of Government, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to this symposium on the face of hate, the investigation and prosecution of hate crimes. This symposium has been sponsored both by the criminology department of our McKenna School and by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission and its executive director, Chad Lassiter, and we sincerely thank them for their help and support in this. We are pleased also to have the support of the Westmoreland Bar Association and many local groups who have joined us, who are actively participating in the effort to guarantee rights of all citizens and build a positive community. To me, the term hate crime is perhaps something of a misnomer or something that is possibly too over-inclusive. Those of us who have been in the criminal justice system for many years know that many crimes are crimes of passion, crimes committed under circumstances that generate a hatred in one person of another that leads to an act of violence. But hate crimes, as we know them, are in many senses deadly because they are impersonal. The victims are not people who have had any history with the assailant. They are not people who have done anything to them. They are people who are targeted simply because they are a member of a group. And that group and the targeting of them is something extraordinarily difficult for all of us to understand. Hate crimes, of course, have been around for centuries. One could arguably say that the Emperor Nero committed a hate crime when he systematically eliminated the Christians after he conveniently blamed them for a fire in Rome. One could clearly say that Hitler's infamous Final Solution was a horrific attempt to eliminate an entire group of people, the Jews of Europe. In America, early colonists carried out crimes against Native Americans, and the Klan in the United States has arisen at least 3 times. First, as an attempt to terrorize freed slaves. Second, when immigrants came to this country to fuel the burgeoning Industrial Revolution, and Jews and Catholics and immigrants generally were targeted from the Klan as people who were threatening to destroy what the Klan believed was the proper white Protestant America. And the third time the Klan arose was during the days when brave men and women led the civil rights movement in the 1960s and threatened to destroy the Jim Crow laws that had persisted since the time of the Civil War. This form of hate seems to me to have as its root irrational fears. And as I thought about these events, I thought about a movie I saw many years ago. And if you haven't seen it, I commend it to you. It's a movie called The Man in a Glass Booth. It's a story of an individual charged with being a Nazi war criminal. And it stars the actor Maximilian Schell in a brilliant performance. He plays the person accused of the Nazi war crimes. And many times during the movie, he expounds on why he was such a devoted follower of the Third Reich. And at one point he says, after the First World War, Germany was in ruins. Our economy was in shambles. We were poor and we were afraid. And Hitler came and he told us what we were afraid of because we didn't know what we were afraid of. And he told us that we were afraid of the Jews. And all of a sudden, we weren't afraid anymore. Fear leads to hate, and hate leads to violence. There will always be the potential for irrational fear, and there will always be those who will work to direct others to a simple, violent solution to that fear. It is a lesson of history, and one we must guard against. We have experts here tonight to talk about these critical areas. Nathan Williams has spent the last 20 years of his life as a prosecutor, first in the state courts of his home state of Michigan, and later in South Carolina. And for the past 10 years, He has served as an assistant United States attorney in charge of the Charleston Federal Prosecutor's Office. He has prosecuted many serious white-collar and violent crimes, but among those, Mr. Williams and other Department of Justice lawyers successfully prosecuted the first federal death penalty case involving hate crimes, the prosecution of Dylann Roof for the 2015 murder of 9 parishioners attending a Bible study in a South Carolina church. He was rightfully awarded a Distinguished Service Award from the Attorney General of the United States for his efforts in that case. We are honored to have him with us. Please help me welcome Assistant United States Attorney Nathan Williams.
Are y'all picking me up on this? Okay. All right. As Bruce said, my name is Nathan Williams. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney in Charleston, South Carolina. I present on this case fairly often to groups about this size. What I'm going to ask you to do is if you have questions somewhere through this presentation, raise your hand and ask me. I don't want to get too far along and talk about things that I think you may be interested in if there's other things you want to hear about. So I would ask that you ask me questions if you have them. I want to talk today about the Dylann Roof prosecution. As Bruce had said, it was the first capital case under the Matthew Shepard Hate Crimes Act. It was tried by me and 4 of my colleagues, so I don't want to take too much credit for the case. We had 3 attorneys from the Department of Justice and a colleague of mine from South Carolina. It happened in June of 2015. We went to trial, as this first slide says, end of 2016. Some of you in the criminal justice system would realize that that's a pretty quick turnaround. A year and a half from crime to trial is exceptionally fast. A year and a half from crime to trial into death penalty cases, that much quicker. So it was a lot of work, and I'm going to go through, I think, what I feel is interesting about the case, but certainly ask questions as we go. I want to talk a little bit about Charleston. Normally I don't have to talk much about it. Most of the presentations I do are close to where I live, but Charleston is a coastal city in South Carolina. It is a big tourist destination. If you haven't been there, you should probably go. The secret's getting out, so don't go to Myrtle Beach, go to Charleston. But it is sort of affectionately known as the Holy City. There's an anecdotal, if not an actual rule, which is nothing in the city can be built higher than the church steeples that make up the landscape of the church and the cityscape. It is, in that sense, rooted in religion and rooted really in this diversity of churches. And the church we're going to talk about today, Mother Emanuel, is an AME church, African Methodist Episcopal. It was founded in Baltimore, but the Mother Emanuel Church, or Emanuel in South Carolina, is the oldest, second oldest AME church in the United States, and has a tremendous history, not just in this country, but certainly in South Carolina, Civil Rights era and the Civil War era. It is located on what's now known as Calhoun Street. When we were sort of preparing this case for trial, we sought to try to find the history of the church, and we found these great videos of some of the victims, the pastor of the church, talking about the history. And what he said is that what is now known as Calhoun Street during the Civil War was actually called Boundary Street. And the church was not allowed to be within the boundaries of the city. Emanuel Church had to be on the outside of the city. And at the time, this was pre-Civil War, it was outlawed, frankly. There were concerns that it was going to be the source of slave rebellions in the city of Charleston. The Citadel Military Academy was first created as a local armed guard in the city of Charleston to prevent slave uprisings. And they built the Citadel 2 blocks away from where the Mother Emanuel Church is. It was burned down several times. It was closed during the time of the Civil War. Denmark Vesey, who was a well-known leader of a slave revolt, was a member there. And so it has a long history during the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, certainly was the focal point of post-Civil War efforts in the city of Charleston, and sort of maintains that sort of recognition now. That was not lost on Dylann Roof. If you go into Wikipedia or go onto the internet and Google about Mother Emanuel, you'll hear all of this history. So when he was sort of targeting and deciding where he was going to commit his crimes, where he thought it would get the most attention, he frankly chose that because of that history. The current church as it stands was built, I believe, in the 1870s, sometime after the Civil War. It's been modified a couple of times, but because of that, it has very heavy walls, heavy thick wood doors made of oak, heavy walls, and the way the church is set up, there's a sort of a fellowship hall in the basement and a sanctuary on the ground floor. And on June 17th of 2015, the night of the shootings, they were actually having a regional meeting, a business meeting inside the church. And so a whole bunch of folks were showing up for this regional business meeting. They were giving out certificates of ministry for preachers that night. And after the business meeting, they were going to have their usual Wednesday night Bible study. At the time, the church did not have any surveillance cameras inside. These red arrows will show you where they had surveillance cameras on the outside, and I think, at least at this time, there had been church shootings. The Sikh temple shooting had occurred. Sutherland Springs had not occurred yet. Tree of Life had not occurred yet. At this point in time, they were soft targets. There weren't people putting up guards at churches. There weren't security cameras inside, and frankly, these cameras were outside to keep track of the parking lot for people breaking into cars. When we went back and obviously pulled that video, we started seeing sort of the folks that were showing up throughout the day to the church. The first is Sharonda Coleman Singleton. Sharonda was a minister, a preacher. She was known as a powerful preacher, the type of preacher that people would travel to see. She'd go to different churches and she'd have a following that would go behind her. As much as she was a preacher, she was a mother. And I think we saw this with a lot of our victims in this case. You see her here, her three children. They're a lot older now. The young man standing up is Chris Singleton. He was drafted by the Chicago Cubs a couple of years ago. He's currently in their minor league system. I think, it's lost in a lot of things people say about him, but when his mother was killed, he took care of those two kids too, as his brother and sister, and so he's somehow managed to raise his brother and sister, play professional baseball, and I think a week ago he got married on live TV on some network show, so he's out there. Susie Jackson is the next person we see coming into the church, and some of these folks are showing up pretty early. They stayed in the church all the time, right? These were the Sunday and the Wednesday church folks. Susie Jackson was 89 years old. She was sort of the organizer of the retired and elderly folks in the church. Her family's name was on every plaque in that church, somewhere or another. She's the matriarch. So the Jackson family was big in the church. She would go on these big, extravagant trips to see her family, take the whole family with her. They'd rent buses to go visit their family. And I think, to sort of show a little bit of who Dylann Roof was, she was 89 years old and he shot her 11 times. She was laying face down on the ground and he was probably 2 or 3 feet away. And I think, when we talk about hate crimes, it is focusing the greatest amount of violence on the most vulnerable person possible. And that's what we saw with Ms. Jackson. This is Ethel Lance. She came in one of the other doors. We didn't have her, that was in a video. This is on Selfie Sunday, the Sunday before the shooting. I think the picture on your right is especially telling. She was the center of the family, to say the least. And it was interesting how these shootings affected people. Some people came together. Their family struggled. She was sort of the fabric that held the family together. Her son, Gary, with special needs. So some people were just lost without these folks in their life. She was the sexton of the church. She took care of it. She was the one that cleaned up on the weekends, was always there. And we saw the same thing with her family. DePayne Middleton was another preacher, reverend. You see her just walking in quickly. A lot like Sharonda, she had daughters that were her spitting image. 4 daughters, and they would always say that their mother told them how good they could be, how special they were, and they didn't realize it without her. And she was also known for being very loud at the volleyball games, so advocating for them, right? So that night, the 4 daughters were known to sort of follow behind her like ducklings. They were going to go to the church service that night and then to the Bible study. They had some car problems. I think if they hadn't had that, they would have been there as well. So Dan Simmons Sr. is also a preacher. He is sort of known as the backbone of what's called Mother Emanuel. Emanuel AME is also called Mother Emanuel because it's influence across the country to other AME churches. So he was sort of a mentor to all of the other preachers. They were giving out certificates that night, and he had literally mentored most of the other preachers that were there. He was in the military, he was a counselor, and then he was in the ministry. And I think it tells you a little bit about him that when Roof first started firing, Simmons was the first one to sort of run at him. He said he shot Clemente Pinckney, who I'll talk about in a little bit, shot him first. Simmons was out of his chair, said, "You shot my preacher," ran right at him, and then was shot several times himself, later fell in a doorway. You see him in this other picture, I think, understandably proud, where his son and his grandchildren are getting diplomas on the same day, so he was obviously a family man too. Myra Thompson is the one you'll see walking out the door. So we reviewed all of this footage of trying to capture where people were, who comes in and out of the church, sort of standard investigative practices, and you would not see her standing still for more than about 3 seconds. She was the sort of church busybody. I'm not going to say she was, she told stories, put it that way. She gossiped a little. But you'll see her here. She was getting ready to retire, and her husband, Tony Thompson, had been a probation officer. I knew him when I used to work in state court. He was also in the ministry, had his own church. And their plan was to retire into the ministry. She was getting her preaching certificate that night and was leading the Bible study. Every year, Tony leads a Bible study on the anniversary. He uses the notes she had from that Bible study and leads one at the church. I think it also says a little bit about the people that were there. Several people didn't want to stay for the Bible study because it was kind of late. But they stayed because Myra was going to be leading her first Bible study, so they stayed for her. Some people said, I think Cynthia Herds, had said, "I love you, Myra, I'm going to stay because you're preaching tonight." Tyrone Sanders was the youngest victim. He was 26, and I think it tells you what you need to know about him, that he was 26 and at a Bible study at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night. You see his family here, his mother, Felicia, his father, Tyrone. Great folks, and he was a great individual. He had all these ideas about what he was going to do, start businesses. He was getting graduate degrees, running a barber shop. He was doing everything at once. When the shooting occurred, he was shot pretty early on, but towards the end of the shooting, when Dylann Roof came around to the end of the tables where Tyrone's mother was and where an 11-year-old was there, he actually stopped Roof. So he was shot, bleeding, managed to tell Roof, "You don't need to do this, we mean you no harm." And I think that got a lot of attention, but it tells you a lot about Tyrone that, sort of in the face of all this horrific violence, he was able to say, so we mean you no harm. Roof then shot him several times and killed him. So Clemente Pinckney was the pastor at Mother Emanuel. He was also a state senator. And maybe for this audience, I should mention, although there's an A on the end of his name, he was named for a baseball player in Pittsburgh, Roberto Clemente. So and he was also somehow a big Steelers fan. So I think he was named after Roberto Clemente and then adopted the Steelers. And there was a story they told at trial where his wife surprised him for Christmas one year, bought him Steelers tickets to watch a game. So he's a big fan of the local sports here. What you see here is him and his family sort of walking into the church. His wife, Jennifer, was in the church that night, as well as this young girl. They were actually in an office behind where the shooting occurred. Rounds entered the room where they were, but they weren't hurt, they weren't hit. Roof tried to open the door to that room, but they had it locked. And I think, he was a state senator, he was a pastor at a big church, but I think you see this and you realize he was also a family man. You see his daughter trying to sneak out of that door a couple times and keeps it in her place. This is Cynthia Hurd. She was a librarian at one of the Charleston County Libraries. She'd been there for 30 years. She is showing Clemente a diagram she made for the business meeting showing the history of the church. And you'll see a picture here. She had several brothers, like 4 brothers and a sister. Just in the day before the shooting, the day before she was killed, she had told her sister, who had just been diagnosed with cancer, "I'm going to come out, I'm going to help you, we're going to get through this. I've got you, you don't need to worry about it." That was the person she was. I mean, she didn't tell her husband, but her plan was to move to Virginia and be with her sister, so I'm not sure she would have done it. But, and also just a noted librarian. She was at the College of Charleston Library as well as the county library, and after she was killed, they ended up naming the library where she was a supervisor in her name. The next person you see come in, so about 25 minutes later, is Dylann Roof. He drove in a car. It wasn't real clear to us initially that he had driven in a car. For those of you in law enforcement, that creates a logistical problem. When you think somebody's on foot, you don't know that they have a car, you set up a perimeter within the city. And so initially, until we pulled the video, we thought he had walked in and walked out. Unfortunately, he'd driven quite a ways off. So a few things about this. One, there's a college, the College of Charleston is right there on campus. The church is in a pretty quiet part of town. And I said before, the walls are thick, the door's thick, but there's pretty good foot traffic a couple blocks away. It's a heavy tourist area, but it's also quiet right where that church is. Just by example, I think Roof fired 74 rounds from a 40 cal, and nobody heard a thing outside of the church. There were students a house away that didn't hear a thing, people in a hotel across the street that didn't hear a thing. So one, he could have been a college student. So when he walks into the Bible study, people are not surprised that he comes in. They had seen college students come in before, and also they'd seen people come in that needed help. So I think Felicia Sanders said and testified that when Roof came in, she thought he was somebody that might need some help, and she was going to offer him help at the end of the Bible study to see if he needed a place to stay. She was Tawanza's mother, and she had a habit of taking in all sorts of folks that were his friends, and they would sort of stay at her house as needed. A couple of other things to note, obviously, is the fanny pack around his waist. Again, I think churches at that time were soft targets. Nobody thought anything about that. So in the fanny pack, Roof has a Glock 40 cal handgun. He's also got 8 magazines, and each magazine has 11 rounds in it. So he made an obvious effort to pick up this white nationalist symbolism. It's throughout the case, and I'll talk about some of that later. But he was making every effort he could to show his white nationalism, to show his what he called white nationalism and his leanings that way. And so some of you that are familiar with that symbolism, 88 is for the 8th letter of the alphabet, HH, which is Hail Hitler. And so he wanted to be sure he had 88 rounds so everybody would understand what his motives were. This is a diagram of the fellowship hall. It's sort of in the basement of the church. It's not a basement as you might think, but it's like 2 or 3 steps down, so just below ground level. I'll use the center screen. These tables here are where they had the Bible study. The office back here is where Jennifer Pinckney was with the young girl. This is where the victims were all seated around the table during the Bible study. There's 2 people that I don't have on here towards the end. This end was, 3 people. At the end was Felicia Sanders, Tawanza's mother, an 11-year-old girl, and then a woman named Polly Shepard. Those 3 survived the shooting, sitting at the end. Roof walks in and the Bible study has already started. As a 26-year-old may do, Tawanza did a Snapchat during the Bible study. I'm not sure how big of an audience he had, but he sent out a Snapchat of the Bible study. This is a still from it. Snapchat is notoriously hard to capture, but we were able to get a friend of his who had it on his phone and get a copy of it. And what you see here is Dan Simmons leading the Bible study. You can just see the top of Clemente Pinckney's head on the far right. And this is when Roof came in, he sat down next to Clemente Pinckney. I think Sharonda Coleman Singleton said, "Pastor, we have a guest." He said, "Come on in." They sat him down right next to him, gave him a Bible, pulled a chair out for him, and gave him a list of the notes about what they were talking about that day, what the lesson was. This is another still from that same video. What you see there is Roof on the far right side of the tables. He's the one with the blonde hair. Myra Thompson is next to him. Then DePayne, Middleton, closest to us. So he sat there for, let's say, about 40 minutes. They were talking about the parable of the sower. I'm not going to try to know the Bible with this group, so some of you probably know it way better than I do. So they were studying the Bible there, and the people said, like, they were telling stories, right? Middleton was talking about her children, and people were laughing. Roof was laughing along with them. He wasn't, fully engaged, but he sat there with them and talked with them about the Bible, about their families for 40 minutes or so. And they had a practice at the end of each Bible study, at the end, to do the mitzvah benediction. It's from the book of Genesis, I believe, and it basically says, may the Lord be between you and thee while we're away, or somebody else knows it better than me, sorry. Somebody always knows the Bible better than I do when I give a lecture. So may the Lord be between you and I while we're apart? Okay, good. So the tradition was and it's a very nice benediction, right, at the end of their meetings. And the tradition was they would join hands, they would stand up, they would close their eyes, and then they would have this prayer. And so, Dylann Roof, being the person that he is, finds the time where they're most vulnerable, finds the time when they are at their weakest, and he just opens fire. He's in a seated position from right next to Clemente Pinckney, and the first round, probably 2 magazines of rounds, go straight down the side of the table and at Clemente Pinckney. The first shot's hit Clemente Pinckney. So Pinckney gets hit 2 or 3 times on the left side, gets up and turns, runs towards where his wife and child are, gets hit 3 more times and falls right there and is killed. Dan Simmons is the first one up. He comes at Roof, says, you shot my pastor, you shot my pastor. He's hit 2 or 3 times. He actually manages to run towards this back door area here. He collapses in that door. He's still alive when first responders show up. And as Roof is walking out, I'll show this later when he comes out the door, he shoots Simmons at least twice while he's lying on the ground. We have the projectile marks on the ground, the damage to the floor, and the trajectory was pretty clear. So, Simmons, I think, went at Roof, was shot several times, and then was trying to get outside to get help or get to his car, and didn't quite make it out the door. The first set of rounds hit all of the folks that are going to be at the bottom of your screen. Sharonda Coleman Singleton was probably killed then. She was hit several times. Probably Myra as well. DePayne was probably hit once, so there were some people that were hit one time, like Tawanza was shot in the throat. There was a lot of blood. We know that he was still alive when he came back around because he was talking to him despite being shot. So several rounds down that side of the table hit multiple victims, and he also kills Clemente Pinckney and likely had fatal shots on Dan Simmons. So once he does that, I think at the time, probably a unique thing happens. As I said, there hadn't been, apart from the Sikh temple, there hadn't really been a lot of high-profile church shootings. And so there's kind of been questions about what happens next and what people would do. I think people thought maybe he had a specific target there. And so Dan Simmons went towards him. Everybody else just jumped under the tables. When they took cover under tables, about the exact same as these, with plastic covers, plastic tables, and maybe shielded a little bit of the vision, the sort of field of vision for the shooter, but didn't provide any protection. So they dive under the tables, and Roof then just walks through the church, frankly shooting all of them multiple times. He goes around the top of the tables first. He shoots Cynthia Hurd, I want to say 7 times. And I should say all of these folks are face down on the ground. When she was found, she was in a praying position, and she was obviously a woman of religion, but he shot her from 2 or 3 feet away, shot Myra as well as DePayne, who'd been hit before. I think they were both shot 5 or 6 times. He then comes around the top of the table. Ethel Lance is under the table. He shoots her, I believe, 5 times. And as I said, Susie Jackson, who was at the top, was shot 11 times, which, as I said before, he was carrying clips that had 11 rounds in them. So he literally went through an entire clip, on an 89-year-old woman from 2 or 3 feet away. The shot pattern on those was so, it was within, some shots were overlapping, which if you do any kind of law enforcement, is from shooting from a very close distance and just not moving. So he stood over her and just shot her that many times. So an interesting thing happens at the end of the tables. There's Tyrone Sanders is there, his mother, Felicia, is there, Polly Shepard, who is at the end of the table, I don't have a picture of, is there, and there's an 11-year-old girl there. Polly Shepard had worked in a jail for some time, so she had some experience with I guess, violent individuals. She certainly wasn't, going to get up and go after him, but what she did is when he came around the corners, he looked at her, or she looked at him, looked him in the eye, and then he started to talk to her, and he said, don't look at me and shut up. She was praying out loud. He told her to shut up, and she kept praying, and he said something to the effect of, I'm 21 years old, and I have to do this. Meanwhile, Tawanza was there with his mother, Felicia, and the 11-year-old girl, and as all of this is going on, Felicia and Tawanza are communicating under the table. Tawanza's hit, and Felicia has to make some decisions, right? She has an 11-year-old, and she has her son who's been shot, and she has said several times she had to make a choice between her granddaughter and her son, and she frankly chose her granddaughter as Tawanza would want it. She testified and actually rolled around in some of his blood and tried to get his blood on her legs and on her feet. She did that so that Roof would think she was dead. She grabbed the young girl by the mouth, kept her quiet, pulled her as tight as she could without hurting her, and they pretended that they were dead there. Part of the reason, obviously, Tawanza then creates this distraction is because he realizes that his mother and niece are right behind him, and so he's going to distract Roof from them. So as this short conversation is happening with Polly Shepard, Tawanza sort of gets up onto his elbows despite being shot and then says to Roof, why are you doing this? Roof responds that you all are raping all of our white women and you all are taking over the world. This is going to come up more and more in his sort of white supremacist rhetoric and his worldview, but clearly that was his articulation at that time. He then shoots Tawanza, I think, 2 or 3 more times and kills him there. What he doesn't do, though, is he doesn't shoot Felicia, he doesn't shoot the child, doesn't shoot Polly. So he then leaves and goes back the same way he came in. As he walks out the door, you'll see here he's actually stepping over. You'll see him here leaving at 9:06, stepping over the body of Dan Simmons, shooting him, and stepping over. Let me get through this quick and I'll. He had said several times that he thought there would be law enforcement out there. He kept a clip of rounds in his gun. I'll get to this in a minute, but when he was stopped later, he still had the gun. He didn't have any kind of shootout, so he claimed he thought he was going to get shot by law enforcement. I'm not sure I believe that, but as I'd said, he drove off in his car thinking law enforcement would be there. There were several witnesses in the hotel across the street, college kids in the house next door, and they never heard a thing. So he walks out the same way he walked in. For a question?
Did he ever say why he didn't shoot those people? Was it before we had that conversation? Personal life? Just trying to figure that out. You certainly have that condition.
Yeah, the question was if Roof ever said why he didn't kill the remaining 3 people there. He said he was tired. I mean, literally said, I was tired. He later said I wouldn't kill a child, but I don't know if I believe that either. I think, frankly, he was probably tired. He had fired 74 rounds, and 62 of those rounds hit someone. So, that really gives you an idea of how close he was to the victims. To have that many shots hit someone is a pretty high rate. And I think the average, nobody was shot less than 5 times, and the most was 11. So it wasn't, it's a good question as to, why he really didn't kill everyone. But I think the answer is, I think he'd done what he thought he was going to do, and I think Tawanza distracted him. I think he was in a place where he was shooting everyone, and then once Tawanza sort of interrupted him, he just walked out, gave up on it. There were certainly shell casings and magazines sort of throughout, so it was definitely methodical. But yeah, I don't know that he would later say that If he did, he said he sat there for 40 minutes. He thought about not doing it, then he realized if he didn't do it right then, he was never going to, so he just did. So I think, he had a plan going in, but I'm not sure he had an end game in mind. What you hear on there is one, in the background is Felicia talking to Tawanza. You hear Tawanza gasping a little bit. Tawanza doesn't die right away. He is actually alive when first responders get there. He's alive when the first folks come through. He passes away shortly after. And you also get this sort of, I'm going to call it some trauma effect. Polly thinks that Roof is in the building. We were able to sync up the 911 call with the video. He's from the exterior. He's clearly outside at that time. You won't change her mind on that. Felicia swears that when the first shots were fired, the lights went out, that a transformer blew. She swears it went black for a second. And that didn't happen either, but she remembers it that way because that's how she experienced it. And again, so although Polly thinks that Roof is in there reloading, I think he's actually outside and driving away in the car. Do you have a question, sir?
In light of this horrific event, two questions. Has this church changed any security procedures? And do you have any recommendations what churches can do?
So yes, it has changed procedures. I will say, the Sunday after they were holding services at Mother Emanuel, and they struggle with having security. Like, they want people to come in the church. They want people to come in off the street. They don't want to exclude people, but they've got a whole bunch of cameras and a whole bunch of security guards. Frankly, recommendations are a bit beyond my expertise. I mean, we can talk about ways to identify mass shooters, hate crimes, defendants, but there's a whole lot of people with those opinions. I don't know that I'm in the best spot to sort of give you that. We can talk afterwards with some ideas, but I'd hate to give that advice sort of with a group. The next thing I'm going to show is a little bit hard to watch. So the next video is a body cam of one of the responding sergeants. We played this at trial, obviously. We had to litigate extensively to keep this from the media, meaning we did not want this on the news. The judge was giving out exhibits during trial. Literally, we would put an exhibit in during the day. It would be made public and in the news that night. Some of these things are certainly public. They're all public at some level, but if you wanted to watch these videos, you have to go to the clerk of court in Charleston, go to the courthouse, sit down at a computer, they'll play it for you, and you don't get a copy. So we fought to keep our victim materials private. I have done this presentation to survivors, to victims. They understand that if I play this, it's not gratuitously. It's so that you all sort of understand what this is, but I'm asked that you all don't film it. I think we just have the two cameras. Again, we kept it from the media. I'm also going to say, if y'all have kids here, some of these kids might not want to be in here. There's some blood. It's hard to watch for adults, so I would ask that if, it's at your discretion as parents, but it's not always easy things to watch. So what you're going to see in the next slide, the Charleston Police Department responded to the shooting as an active shooter. There was a little bit of debate between the sergeants, but they basically brought everybody from the area, showed up, treated it as an active shooter, and what that means is they kind of go in first looking for the shooter and don't, frankly, pay much attention to the victims. Two of the first ones that came in go straight down the side, so there's two officers with handguns. They both run down the sides of the church. There's an officer that stays behind with a long gun to cover them in case the shooter is somewhere inside the building and they need cover. They both say that Tawanza was still breathing, that Tawanza actually pointed one of the first guys through to the door, Roof left. The other one said that Tawanza said, "Help me," as he went past him. They immediately then start clearing the building to varying degrees of success because, frankly, it's a hard thing to do when there's so much going on. The video you're going to see here was from one of the sergeants who was effectively holding the perimeter of the area. And so from a law enforcement perspective, they want to set up a perimeter as quickly as they can. They had Polly saying he left on foot. Their goal is to set up a wide perimeter, hope they can catch him somewhere within that perimeter, not knowing he had a car, so that was not real helpful. And you'll see another sergeant who's inside talking to Felicia. So what you're going to see in the video also is that Polly Shepard will be the first one that comes up and talks to the officer. You'll see him trying to get a count of the number of folks in there. He walks to the end of the building and says, hang on, to Dan Simmons. You'll hear Felicia saying, "My baby's dead, my baby's gone." That's when Tawanza passes away. And I think one of the first officers did a really good job. He tried to separate the 11-year-old from the bodies, and you'll see he does that, and then 2 minutes later, she's walking around the bodies again. So I'm going to play some of that, but again, it's a little hard to watch. There's not a lot of blood, but you'll obviously hear some emotion. What you see there is, sort of in the background, is Tawanza still alive when they come in. John Lights, who's that sergeant who's in the middle of the room, the shorter guy with the short hair, he testified that Tawanza was there talking, trying to breathe. He held Tawanza's hand. Tawanza was actually also reaching for Susie Jackson, who was, as you heard Felicia, also her aunt. So they were related. Tawanza had the sergeant's hand, and his mother was there, and then he just took a couple of breaths and passed away. And that's when you hear Felicia saying, my baby's dead. She calls Tyrone, her husband, says, my baby's dead, and Aunt Susie. I think that gives you a little bit, I'll say for these officers, the big guy that's there left almost immediately. The younger guy that was there left. The sergeant retired. I see the sergeant who has a body cam once in a while. I think he's still working. But it had a significant effect on those guys. I mean, the guy that was in the door with the long rifle was the only one who was still there, and he had served in Afghanistan. He'd been in some war zones. He kind of had some experience with that. So it affected, obviously, a lot of folks in ways they hadn't thought about. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the population of Charleston and then the law enforcement response. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on it with this group, but so the church is downtown, the Charleston Police Department is nearby, the Charleston Resident Agency for the FBI is in Mount Pleasant, so right across the river. It was, to say the least, for those of you in law enforcement, a bit chaotic. At first, it's really quiet in that church, right? You see that body cam, there's not a whole lot of officers there. Within 5 minutes, there's everybody with a blue light on the street trying to come in there. Media's trying to get in. Victims' families are trying to get in. They know their family members were at the Bible study. They're trying to get inside the church. Just as a way of setup, so there's an FBI out of Columbia is the main office. There's a resident agency, so a local office in Charleston. And what we had was really sort of a joint effort between state and federal law enforcement to sort of begin the investigation of Roof. And first of all, sort of the manhunt and find out where he was. I will say that this came quickly on the heels of the Walter Scott shooting. You all probably saw this in the news. So this was in the city of North Charleston. Not a huge distinction unless you're with those departments, but Michael Slager was a police officer of the city of North Charleston, shot Walter Scott in the back from about 60 feet when he fled based on a traffic stop. I was involved in that case after Roof, sort of the other attorney in our office retired, so I picked up the tail end of it. He got 20 years in federal prison for that shooting, but you had these sort of right one after the other. One was in April, one is in June, and all of a sudden there's all these questions about Charleston, and is there a race problem, and it really compounded the problems that the city was facing with the with the Michael Slager case. Sort of the general response was we had to first secure the site, establish a command post. These are all standard law enforcement responses. There was a very complicated approach to victim management. The first push was folks that were showing up to the scene, and the second push was dealing with the sort of exponential need. Media was a problem, and really the long-term issues, I'll talk about that in a second, were troubling. But I will say, it was a case that sort of tested the resources, so it wasn't like there was a big fight between federal agents and state agents. It was pretty well shared as far as the investigation went. I remember we worked overnight to the next morning, and we had these leads on Roof because the car he drove, we had that make and model. So they went out and were trying to find every Hyundai that was in the area, went through DMV records and just started running leads on all of those. We didn't have a whole lot of other strong evidence. That license plate, we couldn't really get a good read on it. But he did walk in without a mask on. We had those still photos off the video, and there was a decision sort of made overnight to release those videos to the general public to get an idea of identification. This is a picture of Tony Thompson, and I think this sort of shows the dilemma we were facing. Tony Thompson was the one who was going to retire with his wife, Myra, was the one that still leads the Bible studies. like he knows his wife is running the Bible study, right? Word got out quick. I think you saw Felicia walking out with her cell phone. She was immediately calling other people from the church. And, they all knew there was a shooting there. And so Tony found out pretty quickly. And as you see here, I mean, he knows his wife is in there. It was hard for some of these law enforcement people to say, you can't come in. To complicate it a little bit more, I'd say about 2 hours into the securing of the crime scene, and as they were trying to investigate that, a bomb threat got called in. There's this kid in Atlanta, a teenager. Apparently every time there's a big high-profile case, he likes to call in a bomb threat. So he calls in a bomb threat, and they have to step back for a couple of hours. It was pretty telling. 2 of the Charleston Police Department officers, the one that was standing in the middle of the room during the body cam, they stayed. I mean, they said, we're not going to leave these folks here on their own. Despite the bomb threat, they stayed inside the church and sort of waited it out until it was cleared. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the post-crisis operations. I'm going to get back to sort of the hunt for Roof and how he was arrested, but it goes without saying that, one, there was an exponential reaction that you can't anticipate in a case like this. So for the folks in law enforcement, when the president comes to town, it's really hard to manage that. So the amount of security that goes into having the president show up is taxing on a law enforcement agency. So you had the president coming in, you had the vice president, you had all of these folks coming in for church services, and they were really straining law enforcement when they needed to be out investigating the case. So what happened is the local police department really had their hands full dealing with sort of the elected official visits, the security that goes with that, and we also saw this uptick in sort of similar motivation. So, KKK shows up and hate literature starts showing up. People were shooting at churches around town, outside of Charleston. They had to investigate all of those. So we had this uptick also in other activity that tied up a lot of law enforcement. Protests on both sides, all were handled well, but I guess it's something you don't anticipate when you work law enforcement to all of a sudden have this tremendous burden of, I remember getting a call like the day after the shooting, and somebody said that Joe Biden wanted the phone numbers for all of the victims to call them. And if I had them, and I was, of course I don't have them. And it's one of those questions you never get. But if you're in the middle of trying to find this guy and make sure there's no co-conspirators, and make sure he's not working with other people and aren't other shooters, you get questions from the vice president about phone numbers at the same time. And so we dealt with that. The FBI has a really good response team for victims. And one story we tell is, at the time of the shooting, there was a lot of blood, there was a lot of biohazard materials. So when they cleared out the church, they took all the biohazard materials, meaning things that had blood, and dumped them, put them in biohazard bags, put them in the garbage. Well, Felicia Sanders had left her Bible in there, and she wanted it back. She'd had that Bible forever. She carried it everywhere she went. The victim advocates from DC with the FBI went out to the dumpster, got in there, opened those bags, and dug out the Bible. They took it to a dry cleaner. They had the blood taken off of it. It had a bullet hole in it. And, they got that back to her, and she carried it with her to trial, and she held it there. And she referenced it when she testified. So it was that sort of human approach, I think, that, it stands out in a case like this. There was ownership of the case sort of across the board. And what you saw in the city of Charleston, at least, in the face of that, is there a race problem? I think a lot of you saw sort of the forgiveness theme come out. There was, I think 2 days after the shooting, a unity walk on one of the big bridges that's near Charleston, so sort of a landmark there. Folks just came out in a show of support for the victims. I suspect you're seeing saw similar things here in Pittsburgh with the Tree of Life shooting. A strong community support. And it was the same with law enforcement. But what we saw, and it was played up in the news quite a bit, was this idea of forgiveness. The bond hearing the next morning, one of the victims, it was Ethel Lance's daughter, kind of got up during the bond hearing and said, "I forgive you." And that caught on with some other people. I don't know that was everybody's opinion, right? Tyrone Sanders also said at the sentencing that he wanted Dylann Roof to lose a limb for every appeal he filed. So, on the one hand, you had forgiveness. On the other hand, you had some folks that thought the death penalty was the appropriate punishment. But that did catch on in the media, and it was, if in a lot of ways, genuine. in a lot of ways, a trauma response to people who want to take control over a situation. So I think we saw that. They got a lot of attention in the paper. There was also a very good job by the Charleston Police Department to get in front of the case. The police chief had very good relations with everyone in the city of Charleston, including the church leaders. You know, they had told him, if you ever need anything, you call us. He called them and said, you told me if I needed you to call you, I need you to show up, I need you to be behind this microphone with me. We need to say, you know, that we are not going to have the problems they had in Ferguson. We're not going to have riots in the city of Charleston. And, you know, they got ahead of it, and I think did a really good job on that front. So the investigation, I've got 15 minutes, I'm going to move through some of this quick. They set up the tip line after so overnight they didn't have a lot of leads. They had good video surveillance, those videos we showed. They took stills off that video, put them out to the newspaper, and leads start coming in left and right. His family called in on him, frankly. You know, he had friends that knew who he was. His family called almost immediately. So within 2 or 3 minutes of those pictures going out, we had a name and an identification. Not an easy decision. So in the Boston Marathon case, when the media was about to send out the pictures of Tsarnaev, the FBI did, and almost immediately the Tsarnaev brothers go and steal a gun from a police officer and kill him. Because once they know that picture's out, they know they're coming after him, they get desperate and they commit all kinds of horrible things. So there's some risk. But you know, early on, we didn't know, one, the scope of a conspiracy, whether Roof was acting alone, whether there were other people, whether he was going to go to other churches. You know, at some point, you just got to go find the guy. The next morning, he had used his debit card somewhere near Charlotte, so we had one lead that direction. These are the Shelby, North Carolina Police Department officers. They saw his license plate. At first, there was a woman who was driving who'd seen the news that morning, and she recognized the bowl cut, which, you know, everybody did. She sees him driving outside of Charlotte, calls it into the police department. The officers follow him at first, but they misread the plate and didn't have it come back to the right car. So at first they weren't sure who he was, but you know, they pull up to him, walk up on the car, and you know, he's got the gun sitting on the back seat. They get him out, they say, are you the guy that did this up in Charleston? He says, yeah, I'm that person. So no real, I mean, he knew he was gonna get caught and he was effectively ready for it. When they walked up, he had a GPS sitting on his lap. So he had a cell phone, but he didn't have service. He used it as a Wi-Fi phone. So we didn't have a lot of what I would call cell phone records or tower records that would show travel and usage of a cell phone. But we had very strong GPS evidence, which is frankly better. This is his statement, part of it. So this is literally the afternoon after the shootings. You know, he's casual, he's laughing. He laughs, I think, 60 or 70 times through that interview. It lasts about 2 hours. Long term, once he was in custody, we just frankly ran down everything we could. Grand jury subpoenas, interviews, search warrants. I'm not going to go through all of that since we've got 10 minutes, but the GPS showed that he had been sort of casing the church. He'd been there in December. The first time we showed him there was sort of pulling up to the parking lot, sitting there for minutes. So we showed that he had been coming to Charleston several times, casing the church. He left a journal, and this gets into sort of his beliefs. You know, we found in his bedroom at his house that he'd been practicing the symbol, coming up with a white nationalist symbol. These are all sort of different white supremacy symbols. I think in the Tree of Life case, 1488 was a symbol the defendant used. That's the 14 words of David Lane. Can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a white supremacy line. And then 88, the Hail Hitler, and then all these other sort of swastikas and runes and things like that. And so, you know, he had spent this time to not only come up with a symbol, but he had this journal. This is sitting in his car on the back seat. And this is just some quotes from there. He goes through his whole litany of different races and religions, and, you know, which is his beliefs on race. And he didn't just do that. Inside the journal, he had written a URL for a website, and he posted a website that had that same information. So this is the website he activated right before the shootings. He called it The Last Rhodesian. Rhodesia, one of the, as he would say, one of the last minority white-ruled countries or apartheid countries. And so he would wear these South Africa patches, Rhodesia patches, as a reference to that. And on this website, he has this picture. That's Russell Crowe in the movie Romper Stomper. He's a white supremacist in that movie, gets killed. And the link he has is to these photos in the text. And the text is almost the same thing as a journal. So he was very preoccupied with his image. He wanted to make sure his message got out there. If he was killed, not just a journal, but also a journal and a website. He talks a little bit about the things that awakened him, the Trayvon Martin case. He was largely radicalized on the internet. He did a lot of internet research. He talked about it. He would parrot back information about studies, and then that was really his basis of knowledge, was sort of in his bedroom researching things on the internet. These are the photos he had on the website, and in all these photos, so we found his camera in his house. It was sitting on a desk, like right there for us to get. Of these, I think there were 10,000 photos. Of those photos, he pulled 60 that he thought were the most important, and these are some of them. Posing in front of the left is a Confederate your left is a Confederate museum. The middle is a slave quarters at a plantation. Him holding Confederate flags, burning American flags, standing in front of the sign at Sullivan's Island. Sullivan's Island is a port in Charleston where I believe about 40% of African American slaves were brought into the United States. So he would go out there, stand in front of the sign, then stand out at the beach with his 1488 and all his symbols. So he did also uploaded those photos, and we found a whole bunch of those on his camera too. So he was going around the state, taking photographs, using a tripod, setting it up, timing it, and then loading some of those to his website to sort of create that image that he wanted. Other online footprints, he was Stormfront, Daily Stormer, these sort of traditional white nationalist pages. We talked to those guys. The guy from Daily Stormer was out of the country. He wanted nothing to do with us. The Stormfront guy we interviewed him. We're going to call him as a witness at trial. He had a bunch of lawyers just try to claim that they're not about violence. But obviously Roof was on there talking about, in this passage, talking about interracial couples. We found in his car these lists, and I think this was, as I said before, he had a Wi-Fi phone, he didn't have a cell phone. So what he was doing was writing things down and keeping them in his car. This is a list of churches. So all of these are predominantly African-American churches in the Charleston and the South Carolina area. You can't read it real well, but Emmanuel AME was the first one. And there was a predominantly white church out of Columbia, and he had a notation on there right here that said just a tour, so he was making sure he was distinguishing his targets. And there's a whole lot of evidence that he had been plotting this. At one point, he was concerned somebody else would think about it. He wanted to do what would get the most attention, and he said somebody else might think about this before I do it, and then I won't have a chance to get the notoriety I want to my message. And so what we saw with these videos was time after time he was shooting at targets at a sort of torso level and then firing multiple rounds once they were on the ground, which is effectively what he did in the church. About 6 weeks after his arrest, we search his cell because he's on a suicide watch, and we find this journal he has sitting inside of his cell. He's writing this down. We sees it presented at trial, and he says, I'm 21 years old. I don't play pretend. I couldn't go another day without doing something. Sometimes sitting in my cell, I think about how nice it would be to watch a movie, eat some good food, drive my car somewhere. Then I remember how I felt when I did these things and how I knew I had to do something. Then I realized it was worth it, right? So 6 weeks after the shooting, he's saying it was worth it. Another writing, very similar. I want to be crystal clear. I do not regret what I did. I am not sorry. I have not shed a tear for the innocent people I killed. And he goes on to talk about, pity for other people. And, if there's ever a lack of remorse, which is an aggravator and a reason for the death penalty, he sort of personifies it. During the jury selection for the trial, he was wearing some of his jail clothes. He didn't want to change out a few days. He was putting these runes on his shoes, white supremacy symbols. We had our agent testify later to the jury, which was effective, that as you were in this room, he was walking around with these white supremacy symbols on his shoes. Again, pretty effective. We had a lot of victim impact evidence. It goes without saying that this affected folks, and I'm sure you all have seen it here with the synagogue shooting. I want to show one quick Twitter video that Chris Singleton did. Chris is the baseball player that's sort of taking care of his brother and sister now. So after all this evidence goes up of all these folks and how exceptional they were, this is Roof's closing statement during the penalty phase, where the jury decides about the death penalty. And he tells the jury, I think it's safe to say no one in their right mind wants to go into a church and kill people. You might remember I told him I had to do it, and that's not really true. So what he's saying there is I wasn't crazy, I wasn't compelled. I didn't have to do it. I didn't have to do anything, and no one made me do it. We went over that. What I mean when I said that was that I felt like I had to do it, and I still feel like I had to do it. So, you know, end of trial, he kind of doubles down and says, I still feel the same way. And obviously, the jury wasn't out long with that deliberation and gave him the death penalty after about 4 hours of deliberation. My time is up. I will stick around if you all have questions afterwards.